Just after 7 in the morning, the house in Kingston was still quiet. The light filtering through the curtains was soft, almost gentle, the kind of morning that feels ordinary enough to be forgotten. Sly Dunbar's wife walked into the room to wake him, expecting another slow start to the day. But Sly did not respond. There was no sound of movement. No rhythm. No breath she could clearly see. Within minutes, that ordinary morning collapsed into something irreversible. Calls were made. A doctor was contacted. And soon, the men whose drum patterns had powered thousands of recordings, the invisible engine behind reggae, dancehall, pop, and rock, was gone. Lowell Sly Dunbar had shaped how the world heard music for decades. Yet in his final hours, there was no stage, no studio, no spotlight, only a quiet room and a silence that felt heavier than any sound he had ever created. What happened in those last hours before that morning? How does someone so central to global music culture disappear so quietly? And why, even now, does his death leave behind unanswered questions rather than clear explanations? To understand that morning, we have to slow time down. We have to step backward through the final day, the final weeks, and the long road that led one of the most influential musicians in history to a quiet ending far from the noise he once commanded. This is the story of Lowell Sly Dunbar, told not from the height of his fame, but from the stillness of his final hours. The news did not arrive with sirens or flashing headlines at first. It moved quietly, almost cautiously, from Jamaica to the wider world, a short confirmation, a name, an age, and a simple statement that Lowell Sly Dunbar had died. Then the shock began to spread. Within hours, musicians, producers, DJs, and critics across continents reacted almost in disbelief. For many of them, Sly Dunbar was not just a famous drummer. He was a foundation. A presence so deeply embedded in recorded music that it was easy to forget he was a single, mortal human being. Tributes described him as the backbone of modern reggae, the architect behind the rhythm, the man who changed how drums function in popular music. Yet the tone of these reactions carried something more complicated than celebration. There was confusion. And there was an unease that came from how little was known about his final moments. He had not died on tour. Not in a studio accident. Not in the middle of a public collapse. He had died at home, discovered in the morning, after what reports described as a period of declining health. For an artist whose work had once dominated charts, clubs, and radio waves across the world, the contrast was stark. A global giant, reduced in his final chapter to a brief announcement and a quiet room in Kingston. Media outlets rushed to contextualize his importance. Articles retraced his career with Sly and Robbie, his work with legendary artists, his influence on genres far beyond reggae. But beneath the praise, a different question lingered, one that no headline could easily answer. How does someone so essential to music history fade from public view so completely before the end? And what does it say about the nature of fame when the people who build the sound are often invisible until they are gone? For fans, the shock was deeply personal. Many realized they had grown up listening to Sly Dunbar's drumming without ever knowing his face. His rhythms had accompanied their lives, at parties, on long drives, in moments of joy and heartbreak, while the man himself remained largely out of sight. And now, suddenly, he was gone. As tributes continued to pour in, one pattern became impossible to ignore. Almost every message praised his legacy. Almost none mentioned his final days in detail. That absence, the lack of clarity, the missing narrative, became part of the story itself. Because to understand why his death felt so unsettling, we have to look beyond the reactions. We have to rewind further, into the life that led him here, a life defined not by the spotlight, but by what happened behind it. Long before the silence of that Kingston morning, Lowell Dunbar was surrounded by sound. He grew up in Jamaica at a time when music was not just entertainment, but survival, identity, and resistance. The island streets carried rhythms everywhere, from church halls to dance yards, from radios perched in open windows to makeshift sound systems shaking entire neighborhoods. For a young Sly, rhythm was not something you learned from books. It was something you absorbed by living inside it. From the beginning, he was different. Where others followed patterns, Sly dissected them. He listened closely, not just to what a beat was doing, but to what it could become. By the time he entered the professional music world, Jamaica was already producing stars. Singers stood at the front, voices carried the message, and producers became public figures. Drummers, by contrast, were expected to stay in the background, steady, reliable, replaceable. Sly Dunbar refused to be replaceable. When he began collaborating with bassist Robbie Shakespeare, something unusual happened. Their partnership did not simply support songs, it reshaped them. Together, they turned rhythm into a signature. A track no longer started with melody or lyrics. It started with the pulse. This was the birth of Sly and Robbie, not just a duo, but a system. They could adapt to any genre, any artist, any mood, while still sounding unmistakably like themselves. Reggae, dub, dancehall, pop, rock, the borders between styles became irrelevant once Sly sat behind the kit. As their reputation grew, so did their workload. They recorded constantly. Sessions blurred together. Days became nights inside studios where time was measured in takes, not hours. To the outside world, this looked like success in its purest form. Sly and Robbie were everywhere. Their names appeared in liner notes, credits, interviews. Major international artists sought them out, trusting their instincts more than their own. But there was a hidden cost to being indispensable. Sly was rarely framed as a star in the traditional sense. He did not tour as a frontman. He did not cultivate a carefully controlled public persona. He was known primarily through his work, relentless, precise, and demanding. Over time, that identity began to narrow. If you are valued only for what you produce, what happens when your body starts to resist the pace? By the later years of his career, Sly Dunbar had already given more to music than most artists could in several lifetimes. Yet the industry he helped build had little interest in slowing down. Sessions continued. Expectations remained high. And quietly, almost invisibly, the men behind the rhythm began to carry the weight of decades spent holding everything together from behind the scenes. This pressure did not announce itself as a single breaking moment. It accumulated slowly, through exhaustion, through physical strain, through the unspoken understanding that stopping was not an option. Because when you are the backbone, you are not allowed to rest. The darker chapters of Sly Dunbar's life did not unfold in tabloid headlines or explosive scandals. They emerged quietly, in the spaces between sessions, in the physical toll of decades spent pushing the body beyond what it was designed to endure. Unlike many artists whose struggles became public through addiction arrests, breakdowns, or dramatic confrontations, Sly's decline was subtle. It was hidden behind professionalism. Behind reputation. Behind the expectation that he would always show up and deliver. The truth is, drumming at the level Sly Dunbar maintained for decades was not just musical work. It was physical labor. Night after night, session after session, his body absorbed shock, repetition, and stress that few outside the profession fully understand. As time passed, reports began to surface that his health was no longer what it once had been. Nothing precise was announced. No dramatic medical disclosures were made public. Only a quiet acknowledgement that he had been unwell for some time. That silence became part of the pattern. In the music industry, especially for figures who live behind the spotlight, illness often goes unnoticed until it becomes impossible to ignore. There is no grand farewell tour. No public pause. Work simply slows, then stops, without explanation. For Sly, whose identity was so deeply tied to rhythm and production, stepping back carried its own emotional cost. When your value has always been measured by output, absence can feel like erasure. Friends and collaborators would later describe him as private. Not withdrawn, but reserved. A man who carried responsibility internally rather than outwardly. That kind of personality often absorbs pressure without releasing it. It continues functioning long after warning signs appear. It normalizes fatigue. It dismisses pain. And over time, that quiet endurance can become dangerous. The music world moved on at its usual speed. New technologies emerged. New producers took center stage. Younger generations sampled rhythms without knowing their origin. Sly Dunbar was still revered, but reverence does not always translate into care. As his public appearances became less frequent, the narrative around him shifted subtly. Not toward decline, but toward absence. He was no longer constantly present, no longer unavoidable. And yet, the expectation that he would remain Sly Dunbar, unbreakable, precise, legendary, never fully disappeared. This is where the tragedy begins to sharpen. Because the forces that shape a final moment are rarely confined to a single day. They are built over years of imbalance. Years of silence. Years of carrying the rhythm for everyone else. By the time the final weeks arrived, the ground beneath him had already been worn thin. And what came next would unfold not as a sudden collapse, but as a quiet narrowing of the world around him. The final 24 hours of Lowell Sly Dunbar's life did not announce themselves as historic. They unfolded quietly, without witnesses who knew they were watching the end of an era. What can be established begins the day before his death. According to those close to him, Sly spent that day at home in Kingston. There were no reports of hospital visits. No urgent medical interventions. No visible signs of immediate danger. It was, by all available accounts, an ordinary day. He ate. He rested. He spoke with people he trusted. For someone who had been unwell for a period of time, the day appeared unexpectedly stable, even improved. That detail matters. In many cases of sudden loss, the final day is filled with warnings, pain, distress, frantic movement toward help. Here, the opposite seems true. The day carried a deceptive calm. As evening approached, the house settled into routine. The noise of the outside world faded. Lights dimmed. Doors closed. There is no public record of phone calls made in panic that night. No messages later identified as last words. No social media posts that hindsight would transform into cryptic farewells. What happened during the night remains unknown. There are no timelines broken down into minutes. No medical statements explaining a sudden turn. Only the certainty that, at some point between the end of that calm day and the start of the next morning, Sly Dunbar's body failed him. When morning came, it did not arrive with urgency. Just after 7 o'clock, his wife entered the room to wake him. The gesture itself was routine, the kind of small, domestic act repeated thousands of times over a shared life. But Sly did not respond. At first, silence can feel temporary. People pause. They wait. They listen for breath. When that silence stretches too long, it becomes something else entirely. Realization does not come all at once. It arrives in fragments, in the absence of movement, in the stillness of the chest, in the growing certainty that something is wrong. A doctor was contacted. What could be done was attempted. But by the time help arrived, the conclusion was unavoidable. Lowell Sly Dunbar was pronounced dead in his home. No dramatic scene followed. No chaos spilled into the street. No cameras were waiting. The men who had shaped rhythm for generations had passed in a private space, known only to those closest to him. And with that moment came the most unsettling aspect of the story. No official cause of death was immediately released. The public was told only what could be confirmed. That Sly Dunbar had been unwell. That he had died at home. That he was 73 years old. Everything else remained unanswered. In the absence of details, silence became its own kind of sound, louder, in some ways, than any drumbeat he had ever played. Because when someone so influential dies without explanation, the questions do not fade. They multiply. In the days that followed Lowell Sly Dunbar's death, the silence surrounding its cause became impossible to ignore. There was no dramatic press conference. No detailed medical statement released to the public. No official timeline beyond what had already been shared. Only a careful repetition of the same phrases. He had been unwell. He died at home. The family requested privacy. For many observers, this restraint was understandable. Sly Dunbar had lived much of his life away from the spotlight, and his family had no obligation to turn his death into public spectacle. But for a global audience conditioned to explanations, especially when icons die, the lack of detail created a vacuum. In that vacuum, questions began to form. Was his death sudden, or the result of a longer, unseen struggle? Had there been warning signs that were missed or dismissed? And why, in an era where information travels instantly, did so little emerge? Journalists revisited what little was known. They confirmed that no foul play had been suggested. No criminal investigation had been announced. There were no indications of external involvement. Yet uncertainty does not require suspicion to thrive. When an influential figure dies quietly, without a clear narrative, the mind searches for meaning. Not out of malice, but out of a need for closure. Some speculated about the physical cost of decades of intense work. Others wondered whether underlying conditions had worsened more quickly than anyone realized. A few questioned whether the music industry's tendency to overlook the well-being of its behind-the-scenes figures had played a role. None of these ideas were proven. And none were officially confirmed. What remained clear was this. Sly Dunbar's death was not framed as a mystery by authorities, but it became one emotionally, because of what was left unsaid. At the same time, tributes continued to grow. Artists spoke about how his rhythms had shaped entire careers. Producers described him as a teacher who rarely lectured, preferring to demonstrate through feel and instinct. Fans shared stories of discovering his work years after it had already become foundational. In these reactions, another truth emerged. Sly Dunbar's influence had been so widespread that it felt permanent, almost immune to disappearance. And yet, his physical presence had vanished without the dramatic punctuation people expected. That contrast unsettled many. Because if someone who helped define the sound of modern music could leave this world so quietly, what did that say about the way the industry remembers, or forgets, the people who hold it together? In the end, there were no grand revelations. No shocking conclusions. Just an unresolved stillness, layered with respect and unanswered questions. And sometimes, that is the hardest kind of ending to accept. When the noise fades and the questions begin to settle, what remains of Lowell Sly Dunbar is not a mystery, but a presence. His legacy is not contained in a single song or a single era. It lives in thousands of recordings, in rhythms that still move bodies long after their creator has gone. It lives in the way modern music understands the drum kit, not as a timekeeper, but as a voice. Sly Dunbar changed how music breathed. And he did it without demanding attention. Looking back from his final hours, a painful contrast becomes clear. A man who gave rhythm to the world spent his last moments in stillness. A life built on sound ended in silence. There is no neat lesson in that. No simple moral to extract. But there is a truth worth sitting with. Some of the most essential people in culture are the least visible. They carry weight without applause. They hold structures together while standing just outside the frame. When they are gone, we feel the absence, even if we cannot immediately name it. Lowell Sly Dunbar's final hours did not unfold in spectacle. They unfolded in quiet, surrounded by the ordinary details of a life lived mostly behind the scenes. And perhaps that is fitting. Because long after the questions fade, long after the silence of that Kingston morning is absorbed into memory, his rhythms continue to speak. Not loudly. Not urgently. But steadily. Like a heartbeat that never truly stops.